At the same time, in the ruined city outskirts, Cyan, Nana, and Brian went out for a walk under the moonlight. The dragon girl started to fly and Brian began to chase her. Cyan put his hands inside his pants pockets and silently watched them. The dragon girl took a leap, extended her hands forward, closed her eyes, and started to fly. She explained to them that this place was really huge, and she was having a lot of fun. Upon seeing this, Brian began to chase after her. He closed his eyes and with a shout asked her to wait as it was dangerous. Upon seeing this, Cyan couldn't help but feel an inner peace. He began to look at them with a joyful gaze and thought that she looked quite happy. He also remembered that these plains were 10 kilometers away from ruin. Nana slightly turned her head back, closed her eyes, and started to give Cyan a cheerful smile. He thought it should be fine for Nana to do what she wanted here. They had not come alone. Next to him was Karam. With a mocking look, she asked Cyan if he was already a father. She advised him to also find a mother like the princess from before since he was in it. Cyan closed his eyes and couldn't help but get angry and think that Karam was very annoying. At that moment, he began to feel immense pressure. He quickly opened his eyes and with a murderous look, started wondering what was happening. She started looking to one side and with a serious gaze, she revealed to Cyan that she felt something approaching. Someone with white hair, which was not far from them, clenched their teeth tightly and thought that this was unpleasant. While Brian was chasing Nana, upon seeing what had appeared in front of them, he couldn't help but panic and start sweating. He began to worry and asked Nana to be careful. At that moment, a powerful blue mana blast descended from the sky and hit the area where Nana was. But luckily, Brian reacted in time, jumped and quickly caught Nana in his arms and fell backwards, avoiding the attack in the process. Cyan and Karam started to look at the mana blast and couldn't help but become alert and wonder what was happening. The mana burst created a strong blizzard that began to move in all directions. Cyan quickly approached them and, while looking towards the mana burst, asked Brian how Nana was doing. Brian picked up Nana in his arms, sat down, and with one eye closed, he looked ahead with the other. With a surprised look, he replied to Cyan that she was fine. Nana, who had her eyes closed, clung to Brian's chest and grabbed his shirt tightly. She was very scared. With a serious look, Karam began to gaze towards the mana burst and couldn't help but wonder who had launched this attack. With a determined look, Cyan began to look up and asked the two of them to stand behind him. At that moment, two dragons landed near them, breaking part of the ground into pieces. These two dragons were Kadlina, who crossed her arms and with a serious look began to stare at Cyan. The other dragon was Lord Lucian, who had his hands in his pants pockets. He put his hands inside the pockets and with a hateful look started to stare at Nana. Cyan didn't take long to realize that they were two high-level dragons. He didn't know what they were doing here. Brian, who was holding Nana in his arms, began to stand up. He started staring at the dragons with a look full of anger, clenched his teeth tightly and couldn't help but get furious. Upon looking more closely, Lucian saw Nana. Seeing this, he didn't take long to come to the conclusion that she was the source of the bad smell. He began to look at Nana with a gaze full of hatred and thought that this stench was truly vile. He was the high-ranking silver dragon named Lucian. Kadlina, who had her arms crossed, started to stare at Nana and upon seeing that she was a dragonborn, she couldn't help but wonder how someone could be such an unpleasant being. She was a high-ranking red dragon named Kadlina. She asked Cyan if he was the master of this half-blood human. Upon looking more closely, she even saw that he possessed a demonic sword, which left her somewhat surprised. Cyan clenched his fists tightly, began to stare at Kadlina and remained silent. Karam, who was floating beside him, became somewhat confused and she asked her who she thought she was to treat her like an object. Just before she could finish her sentence, Kadlina interrupted her. She began to stare at Karam and ordered her to keep silent, calling her nothing more than a lowly human lackey. Upon hearing this, Karam couldn't help but start getting angry. She clenched her teeth tightly and with a furious look asked if she wanted to die. Upon seeing her behavior, Kadlina also began to get angry. She clenched her teeth tightly and with a look full of rage, she asked her how dare she disrespect the dragons in such a despicable way. Just before she could do anything, Lucian put his hand in front of her, indicating for her to stop and not do something reckless. While he had his hand in front of her, he took a step forward, started looking at Karam and explained to her that she could be calm since they had no interest in her. They had no plans to fight against inferior beings. Kadlina clenched her fists tightly, started staring at Karam and couldn't help but get angry. She wanted to teach her a good lesson. Lucian began to look to one side and gave them the order to hand over that half-blood to him. Nana tightly grabbed Brian's shirt and started trembling. Brian placed his hand on her head, stared at Lucian with an aggressive look, clenched his teeth tightly, and thought that this was not good. In a matter of seconds, Nana began to cry and tremble even more. She was very afraid of the dragons. She was half human and half dragon with the blood of two beings. She was going to be worth a lot in the research. While Lucian's body was surrounded by a suffocating aura, he began to stare at Cyan and explained that if they handed over the dragon girl to him, then he would kindly spare everyone's lives. Just before Lucian could finish his sentence, Cyan interrupted him, unsheathed the demonic sword, placed it in front of Brian and Nana, and asked him to be quiet. Upon hearing this, Lucian began to get angry. With a serious look, he asked Cyan what he had just said. He couldn't believe that a mere human was disrespecting him in this way. With a murderous look, Cyan once again asked him to shut up, calling him lizard bastard. Lucian started looking down at the ground and couldn't help but smile. At that moment, someone launched a powerful attack towards Cyan, but luckily he reacted in time and moved his head to the side, dodging the attack in the process. Lucian had been the one who launched the attack. He was flying in the sky. His attack was so powerful that it destroyed part of the ground into pieces. Meanwhile, with one hand Cyan was holding the demonic sword, he stared silently at Lucian. Brian, who was holding Nana in his arms, panicked and couldn't help but wonder if Cyan was okay. With a calm look, Cyan explained to Brian that he was fine and also asked him to stay away from him. While Brian had one eye closed, he turned his head towards him, started looking at him with the other eye and responded with a understood. Nana opened her eyes, grabbed Brian's shirt, started looking at Cyan and couldn't help but wonder if her dad was going to be okay. Brian turned his back on Cyan, and he and Nana began to move away from the area. Lucian's ability destroyed the ground into pieces. While holding the Karam sword with one hand, Cyan started looking sideways and thought that this was a great skill. Lucian unsheathed the spear, and while he was holding it in his hand, it began to emit thunders. He started flying, looked down, and thought that this was the reason why lower creatures lacked saving grace. Cyan activated the ability Thick Fog 9th form called Demonic Sword Manifestation. By doing this, his entire body began to emit an evil mana. While he was holding the Karam sword, he started staring at Lucian with a penetrating gaze. Upon seeing the evil energy emanating from his body, Cadelina's expression changed drastically. She couldn't help but be left speechless. With a surprised look, she began to gaze at Cyan and asked Lord Lucian if that power could be the power of exile. Lucian, who was flying in the air next to her, started looking towards the ground and replied to her that indeed this was the power of exile. Despite seeing Cyan's power, Lucian remained calm. With a peaceful look, he thought that today had been a succession of surprises. He explained to her that although Cyan would fight with all his might, he was nothing more than a humble human. In the blink of an eye, Cyan gained momentum, jumped and appeared next to him. With a murderous look, he prepared to attack using the demonic sword. He didn't take long to feel Cyan's presence. With a surprised look, he began to wonder what was happening. He turned his head slightly towards him and with a confused look, he started wondering when had he done this. Cyan moved back and using the sword, he launched powerful cuts towards him. But to his surprise, Lucian managed to block them with little effort using the spear. While he was blocking the attacks, he began to stare fiercely at Cyan, clenched his teeth tightly, and couldn't help but get angry at seeing a mere human daring to attack him. He began to grow tired of him. He grabbed the spear with both hands and swung it forcefully, but to his surprise, Cyan moved back, dodging the attack at the last second. While his eyes were shining, he reached out towards him and used the ability called Shockwave. By doing this, his hand started emitting small thunders. In the blink of an eye, a magical blue circle appeared in the sky, which began to emit powerful thunder. Cyan started looking up at the sky and upon seeing the magic circle, he couldn't help but panic and think that this was not good. Just before he could make a move, Lucian launched the attack. The magic circle released a powerful burst of mana towards Cyan, destroying part of the ground into pieces. Seeing this, Lucian thought he had won. But then Cyan used the Thick Fog 3rd form called Fog Glide. In the blink of an eye, he appeared behind Lucian and with a deadly look, prepared to counterattack. Lucian didn't take long to feel Cyan's presence. Upon feeling this, his expression changed drastically, with a surprised look on his face. He began to wonder what was happening and how it was possible for a mere human to dodge the attack. Now that Lucian was distracted, Cyan took advantage of this moment and used the fog sword technique called Rushing Fog Storm. Using the demonic sword, he started launching powerful slashes towards him. But just before the attack could hit him, Cadelina appeared behind him, extended both hands towards the attack and used the ability called Fire Barrier. She created a magical circle of fire and managed to block the attack, preventing Lucian from getting hurt. While she had her hands extended towards the magical circle, she started looking at Cyan and with a smile told Lucian that she was going to take care of stopping him. Lucian, who was holding the spear, turned his body back and asked her to step back as Cyan was not an opponent she should face. Upon hearing this, she began to smile and with a determined look, she asked him not to worry about her because she wasn't going to lose. She was so confident because the barrier was a dragon barrier that had accumulated mana for 1,000 years. An insignificant human who couldn't even live 100 years couldn't break it. Cyan began to approach her and with a penetrating gaze, he used the fog sword technique called 8 fluttering petals. Upon seeing this, her expression changed drastically. With a surprised look, she started wondering what was happening. Using the demonic sword, Cyan began to unleash powerful slashes towards the magic barrier. The attack started to impact against the barrier, gradually causing it to break. In a matter of seconds, his attacks shattered her barrier into pieces. Now that the barrier was broken, he started approaching her. Upon seeing this, she couldn't help but become alert. She started looking at Cyan, and while she was watching how he was slowly approaching, she began to wonder how it was possible for a mere human to break through the barrier of such a powerful dragon like herself. While she was lost in her thoughts, Cyan used the ability called Double Serial Slash. He began moving at an incredible speed and attacked Cadelina. After doing this, he landed on the ground and while holding his sword with one hand, he supported the other on the ground and started looking downwards. Cyan cut Cadelina's body into pieces, causing her body to gradually disappear. While Lucian was holding the spear with one hand and watching as her body slowly disappeared, he couldn't help but be in shock. He began to look towards the ground, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked him what exactly he was. He knew that the God of Mist had no authority at all. He didn't know how it was possible for him to have so much power. Cyan landed on the ground, stood up, and remained silent. Lucian ordered him to spit it out and tell them who he was. Cyan slightly turned his head back and silently stared at him. Upon seeing this, Lucian began to look at Cyan with a serious gaze, and upon seeing that he did not want to respond, he admitted that he was a worthy opponent. At that moment, a giant magic circle appeared in the sky. With a calm look, Cyan started to gaze towards the magic circle and realized that he was using the polymorph spell. Lucian entered the magic circle and his body began to change shape. He started transforming into a dragon. Polymorph was a spell that caused a dragon to leave its human form and return to its original form. Little by little, Lucian's body began to transform. First, his face turned into the head of a dragon, and then wings grew out from his back. His body was surrounded by powerful thunder. Several seconds later, once he had completely transformed into a dragon, he opened his mouth and stared intensely at Cyan with a penetrating gaze. He started roaring, indicating that he was ready to fight. Upon seeing this, Cyan leaped and while holding the demonic sword with one hand, he began to advance towards Lucian. With a serious look, he thought that this meant he was at his most vulnerable moment. In the blink of an eye, he appeared above Lucian. He lifted his head, started looking at him with a confused look, clenched his teeth and asked him what he was trying to do. Cyan prepared to attack. Lucian turned his body to the side, started looking at him, and it didn't take long for him to realize that he knew the weakness of the polymorph. Thinking this, he couldn't help but wonder how it was possible for an inferior species like him to know this. While he was lost in his thoughts, Cyan landed on his head and forcefully plunged the demonic sword into his skull. Feeling pain, he opened his mouth and began screaming in agony. At that moment, Cyan's body began to be surrounded by a powerful red mana, which slowly started to grow larger. Upon seeing this, Lucian quickly realized that he was in danger and decided to leave. But unfortunately for him, Cyan was not going to let this happen. He started smiling and told him that it was already too late to escape. Then, he used the fog sword technique called Unshakable Roots of a Great Tree. With a killer look, he grabbed the sword with both hands and plunged it even harder into Lucian's skull. Slowly, Cyan's mana began to enter his body. Lucian's eyes changed from blue to red. He opened his mouth and started screaming in agony. In a desperate attempt, he started flying even higher for Cyan to fall, but it was in vain. In a matter of seconds, Cyan's mana entered his body completely, causing him immense pain. Several minutes later, while Cyan's mana was floating on the ground, Brian, who was carrying Nana in his arms, began approaching the area. While holding her with one hand, he brought the other close to his mouth and started shouting and calling out to Cyan, asking if he was okay. Once he approached the area, and upon seeing what was in front of his eyes, his expression changed drastically. He was left speechless and began to wonder what was happening and how this could be possible. Quickly, he placed his hand over Nana's eyes to prevent her from seeing it. She placed her small hands on top of Brian's hands and told him that she couldn't see. In front of them was the dead dragon Lucian on the ground. In front of the corpse was Cyan, who had a piece of dragon meat on his sword. He took another piece of meat with his other hand, extended it towards Brian, and while he had his mouth full and was enjoying the meat, he asked Brian to eat since it was precious meat. Brian, who was covering Nana's eyes with his hand, became somewhat confused. Nana clenched her fists and told Cyan that she also wanted some meat. Upon hearing this, Cyan responded to her saying no and adding that she couldn't eat this. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.